Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Iris Guzman Kolaya, Joanna Lombard, and Joel Hoffman to discuss El Jardin, creating the modern Mediterranean villa, tracing the origins of one of South Florida's oldest estates and the first to claim a modern Mediterranean identity. Iris Guzman Kolaya is a freelance writer and researcher based in Miami, Florida. A former print and broadcast journalist, she currently specializes in local history, bringing to life stories from South Florida's rich heritage. Joanna Lombard is a practicing architect and professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture. She is co-author with Beth Dunlop of The Great Houses of Florida and with Rocco Cheo of Historic Landscapes of Florida. Joel Hoffman is Executive Director, CEO of Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. In this role, he has broadened Vizcaya's relevance as a cultural and environmental resource through expanded interpretation and community programming, while overseeing the estate's ongoing conversation and rehabilitation. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of El Jardin from Books and Books below by calling us. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think I'm going to start as MC with the real, then we will move the spotlight to the real features of the evening, Terrace and Joanna, who have really done the heavy lifting for this project. Anyone who has had a chance to speak to Iris and Joanna over the years about El Jardin will know that they have an incredible passion for this property. And, I will say they definitely also have a talent for sharing that passion in really a succinct and meaningful way. So thank you both so much for working on this book. I was really pleased to have an opportunity to read a volume on the early history of Coconut Grove and learn more about both the social and architectural connections between El Jardin and Vizcaya. It's a little embarrassing to say I've been at Vizcaya for 17 years, but my colleagues and I are still working just so hard to really understand the context in which Vizcaya and its surroundings came to be and evolved. We still have a very difficult time kind of conveying the personality of James Deering, the life that he lived at Vizcaya, the people he had visit him, those who worked at the property and helped to create it. And it's kind of amazing. Miami is quite a new city. We're talking about history that's only 100 years in the past, but really is still so distant to us and challenging to reconstruct. And I'll also share El Jardin, like Vizcaya, is a property that has undergone incredible changes, both in its physical plant and in its purpose, but both certainly stand as symbols of a bygone era in our community's history. So Iris and Joanna are going to begin by providing us with an overview of their book, but I first wanted you to meet them, and I think it will only take you a moment to see that Iris and Joanna really adore one another and have obviously derived a lot of pleasure from working with one another on this book. Mm-hmm. So congratulations to both of you on this accomplishment. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your connections to El Jardin and how you came together to create this book.
I think I'll take that first. Joel, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And again, thank you to Books and Books. This is such a great opportunity that we have with this local independent bookseller to be able to share an evening like this. So how did we get started in this? I think Joanna and I have asked ourselves a few times, asked that question a few times. This actually was an outgrowth of the Carrollton Centennial Committee. As many of you know, El Jardin is home to Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart. It has been since 1961. And so the school was really looking for a way to celebrate and commemorate the 100 years, the centennial anniversary of the estate, which really speaks to Carrollton's commitment to the estate and preserving its history and sharing that history. Because this is really not a book about the history of the school, which so many schools have done. It really is a history of this incredible estate that the school wanted to be able to share with the community at large. So this book was a project as part of that committee, and I got to meet the wonderful Joanna and work on this project. And a lot of people, too many people to mention, who really came together to make this project happen. And it sort of just morphed into something bigger. It was originally just going to be a coffee table book with some contemporary photos. But Joel, as you were mentioning, it really, those stories and bringing to life the people and the lives that they lived while they were at the property is really such an important piece of the story. That just those beautiful pictures, as beautiful as they are, and they are, Stephen Brooke did an amazing job with them. This really was an opportunity for us to tell a richer story. Joanna?
Well, it's completely true. And thank you, Joel. And it has been so fun to work with Iris. You never know when you start out these projects together. And the Centennial Committee was amazing. Andrea Miares was the leader of it, and she was a supporter all the way along. Each time we'd go back and say, it's a little bigger. It's going to take a little longer. And so it did. But I thought what I could do is give you a sense of the place and why we thought it was so important. And then we'll continue. Iris, maybe you'll pick up the story of the people. Because one of the great things about this was that I had spent a lot of time at Carrollton on the board and as a mom, and understanding it as an architect and a designer. And Rocco Cheo and I had done historic landscapes of Florida. And of course, El Jardin was one of them. And one of the things that's really striking is if you look at this map, it's a historic map of Florida in the 1860s. And what you notice, I think, pretty quickly is that the Everglades was essentially from Lake Okeechobee all the way to Florida Bay. And there's this tiny little finger that comes down. And so if we were drawing Florida correctly, we draw it almost like a crab claw. And Miami, that ridge where people like the Binley family came, or James Deering came, all are sitting atop that oolitic limestone ridge, what William Lyman Phillips called that ancient marine terrace. And the place, why did they come here? Well, the homesteaders who had acquired these 5 acres from the U.S. government, courtesy of all of us, the U.S. taxpayers in that era, they were kind of coming into contact with industrialists from the north who were escaping the winter. And people like Ralph Monroe saw this amazing paradise. And so this image gives you a view of what did it look like? This is Kirk Monroe's place. So this is right in what is today downtown Coconut Grove. And the next image gives you a perspective of who came and where they lived. And I thought that when you look at this, you see how they're all located essentially right along the ridge. And each of these estates are these kind of slivers that go from Main Highway to the bay. And you can see the Binley estate there, the Florida Adirondack School. And what's really kind of amazing about it is if you imagine the Brickell Forest, because basically from the Miami River all the way to Coconut Grove was the Brickell Hammock. And it was this really dense tropical forest. And people who visited each other along this route tended to travel by sailboat. So they were going up and down the coast. And that's why you have the beautiful kind of the barge at Vizcaya, and you have the boathouse that we'll talk about at El Jardin. So imagine coming through this country road, through this amazing wilderness, and then discovering this estate through the Florida pines and the hammock. And Iris, maybe this is a good transition for you to explain about why John Binley chose this as the place to come.
Right. Thank you, Joanna. So our story begins, the El Jardin story begins with the gentleman you see in the corner of your screen. This was already towards the end of his life. John Binley was in his 70s when this photo was taken. But John Binley was a Pittsburgh industrialist. He was born in 1846 in Pittsburgh. And as a young man, he started working at a hardware company. He eventually bought out that hardware company and opened the Binley Hardware Company with his older brother. And together they created one of the largest hardware manufacturers in the United States. From there, that was the platform from which the brothers were able to invest in a number of different companies. And one of them was Pittsburgh Steel, which John Binley eventually became president of, and where he acquired the vast majority of his fortune. And so really, by the time that photo is taken and he's in his 70s, John Binley had acquired a lot of wealth. He had a beautiful home in Pittsburgh's Shadyside neighborhood. He traveled extensively. But what happened was World War I. And so where he would have taken a steamer over to Spain or France, he instead came down to South Florida. And this is an image that you're looking at of John Binley is the gentleman all the way to the left with his family. The gentleman all the way to the right in the lighter suit is actually Ralph Monroe. So a name that many of you familiar with Coconut Grove history should know. This is sadly the only picture we have of John Binley in South Florida. It was taken in Key Biscayne at the big chowder party that William Matheson would host every year for Washington's birthday, what we know today as President's Day. So John Binley comes down to South Florida. He's not going to Europe. And he comes down and he decides to, within 2 months of his arrival, to buy property in both Coconut Grove and also in South Miami. This map that you're looking at, which you can get a better view of in the book, shows the Shenley Park neighborhood, where Nicholas Children's Hospital is today, and then that sort of open field that there's nothing there is what the Biltmore under construction, the Biltmore Golf Course, and the actual hotel under construction. This photo was taken in the early 1920s. This shows the property that John Binley purchased, 120 acres, the equivalent of like the Shenley Park neighborhood, which he purchased to be a farm for Al Jardin. So he bought that property in Coconut Grove, where is the home of Al Jardin, 13 acres, and then he bought this 120 acres to serve as the farm in Shenley Park. Of course, it wasn't called Shenley Park at the time. And then this is a shot of a few images of Al Jardin once it was constructed. So I mentioned it was roughly 13 acres that extended from Main Highway, west of Main Highway, where he built a home John Binley did for his sister, Cherokee Lodge, which still stands today. That was also designed by the same architect, Richard Keno. And then he constructed Al Jardin, which you can see in the center screen. We can date this image to around 1925, 1926, because you can see Bryan Memorial Church today. The Chabad of Coconut Grove is under construction, and that was completed around 1928. And so these are some of the images of...
Iris, before you leave that one, also William Matheson's house is just to the north too.
Yes, and you can see that property with the rows of trees up to the north is Matheson, and then right to the south of Al Jardin is Arthur Curtis James with the long row of palms, the sort of skinny row. So you sort of get a sense of that, and I think we'll discuss later this incredible community that existed along Main Highway, really both East and West Grove, but in this particular image you can see some of the beautiful estates that sadly are for the most part no longer here. So, and we can talk about that. We're very lucky to still have places like El Jardin and Vizcaya, because so many of these estates were eventually torn down and the property subdivided. So you can see some of the gardens here, which I don't want to spend too much time on because I know Joanna is going to discuss them. But you sort of get a sense of why this place was even called El Jardin, right? The garden in Spanish, because it had a series of formal and informal gardens that were just stunning. This is an interior shot of the living room of El Jardin, and the image that you see there, the portrait on the wall, is Adelaide Binley. It's important to mention that John Binley purchased the home in the name of his sole surviving daughter, Adelaide, and so she actually owned El Jardin as well as the farm the farmland in Shenley Park. Sadly, John Binley was not here very long. By the time the home was completed in early 1920, he only had about 2 years left before he passed away. So he passed away at the end of 1921, in November 1921, at the home. El Jardin was again owned by Adelaide, but for reasons that I'm afraid we'll never know, she was not interested in the property, and there's no record of her ever returning to El Jardin after her father passed away, even though she would own it for several more years. In 1925, this family comes along after the Binleys, and these are some of the best pictures we have of El Jardin, because this is the Ritchie family, and it doesn't matter how many times I see these images, they're so much fun. This was, by all accounts, a fun-loving bunch. They sort of epitomized what we think of like the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. They had all sorts of I can say wild parties at El Jardin. There's plenty of accounts of different activities and social affairs that happened at the estate, even bringing up some of the whiskey from the rum runners that were in Biscayne Bay at the time. So the Ritchies really had a good time at El Jardin.
And their daughters actually wrote the poem in the back of the book, right?
Yes, those daughters that are there in that canoe and sitting there came back in the 1970s and actually wrote a poem that is included at the end of the book. So this, some additional photos of the Ritchies. For a short period of time, there was the El Jardin nursery was run out of the gazebo on the property, and there's a postcard there. The Ritchies ran into a bit of hard time with the bust in the real estate market, and so they were unable to pay the mortgage on El Jardin, and they eventually lost the property, and so it was sold in the 1930s to what we know today as Citgo, was City Service, the head of that company, who passed it on to his number two, W. Alton Jones. W. Alton Jones and his wife, and the wife is the one who's seated in the photo at the top, the sort of the elderly woman who's seated outside at the fountain. And so they really use this more for entertaining some of the energy corporate guests that they would have, and then eventually they did live there for a brief time, but they really was more for entertaining. And then later they used it as sort of a retreat for executives, and that's the way El Jardin remained for several decades, until you see this dramatic picture on the right-hand side of these nuns coming on a boat from Cuba, on a ship, a cargo ship actually, amid the turmoil that was happening in Cuba with Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro expelling all of the religious, including the Society of the Sacred Heart, out of the country. And so they come over, and thus begins a search to find a new home for the society in South Florida. And as the story goes, Reverend Mother Agnes Berry fell in love with Carrollton. Fell in love with El Jardin, because it was not yet Carrollton. She fell in love with the property, even though it was not yet for sale. And through some convincing, the society was able to convince W. Alton Jones to sell the property to the Society of the Sacred Heart to create Carrollton School, which has been there. They purchased the property in 1961. And so this has been, El Jardin has been used as a school for nearly 6 decades, which is really, really remarkable. And so I think from there, Joanna, I'm going to toss it to you, and you can talk to us a little bit about the incredible architecture.
Okay, so we'll go fairly quickly. These are all photographs that are in the book from the Carrollton Archive. But what's important is to understand that the Day County pine, it was a pine rockland, and you can see that the pines were kept, they weren't cleared. And the view over the pool on that sort of misty kind of evening, you can begin to imagine what it was like to find this as an estate carved out of a wilderness. Because today we see it in the midst of everything, so it almost is this incredible garden. But at the time, it was carved out. So the approach, one of the things that Carrollton has done recently, those of you may remember maybe 10 years back, when you couldn't see the face of El Jardin. But since that was the historic view, the school actually restored it and opened up the view. So now when you're sitting on Main Highway in traffic, you can take a look to the right, and this is similar to the view you have, except not with the Day County pines. So the next slide gives you a closer view of what's going on inside. And Iris already showed you the living room. But one of the interesting things about the architecture is that Keno, who Iris has also done an incredible amount of research on, and Richard Keno had done a number of homes all around Coconut Grove, but each room had its own theme. So the Chigoresque theme is what you saw in the living room with these beautiful frescoes in the ceiling, and the beams are all hand painted. And the school, we'll talk about this when we get to the new pictures, has made a huge effort to maintain and restore all this. The dining room was based on the Adam brothers. Those of you that know St. James Place in London will be able to kind of recognize the ceiling pattern that's here. Students called it the Wedgwood room because, as you know, Josiah Wedgwood took the Adam brothers' colors and themes and created those in ceramic ware so that one did not have to own an English estate to be able to enjoy the Adam brothers' design. This was the billiard room, which is the library, and on the fireplace there was a beautiful, and it still is there, but not to the state that it was there, but it's like a 15th century fireplace from Ferrara. And from the fireplace, you go out into what is now the chapel. This was the Moorish room. Vanderbilt had one of these in New York, and it seemed to catch on. It was kind of the smoking room. And then you see the kinds of furniture that is in all of these rooms. Fortunately, when Carrollton acquired it, the furniture was all part of the estate. And anyone who's out there who happened to buy anything at the garage sale in the 1960s, that table you just saw, Sally Jude had bought for her home, and she gave it back to the school a few years ago when she moved from her beautiful historic house to another historic house in the French Normandy village. So Carrollton is happy to have these things come back. Anyway, the next room, and so the rooms, this is an upper loggia on the second floor. So when you came into the house, you had this kind of courtyard on the first floor. Then coming upstairs is almost a sort of room that acts like a courtyard for the second floor with the bedrooms on either side. The next image gives you a sense of what it looked like to look into the courtyard. So here we are standing looking into the courtyard and into the master bedroom. And then in the next view, you see the porch that looks out over the pool. So you can imagine what it must have been like with everything open and the breeze coming through. And they were only here in the winter, so it was obviously a really ideal time. And this is the bedroom that's on the south side of the building. And the next one is the beautiful garden house. So this is the one that Iris was showing you had become the nursery. And when Ana Alvarez and Frank Martinez were designing Founders Library, they took this octagonal shape as the theme for the library so that it would get kind of brought back. And you can get a sense of the beauty of what it must have been like to be in this space, the kind of incredible richness of the landscape, the fact that it's tropical, and how different this must have been to come from the winter in Pittsburgh, to this just paradisical place. This is still here. This is actually over on the north side of the property. It's Ulitic limestone columns and a trellis, and it was a small garden, probably a working kitchen type garden. And it's the limestone is still present today. And then these are Stephen Brooks photos where you can see what it looks like today. And essentially when Sister Taylor was the head mistress in the 80s, and then Sister Cook followed her, they began, with the help of Florida's Cultural Affairs Program, to launch a restoration program engaging Jeffrey Stewart and Fine Arts Conservation. We asked all over we looked at all across the country. They were the people that knew how to do restoration in a tropical climate. So this was the garage, which is now an offices at Carrollton. This is the chauffeurs, and the other household people lived on the top floor. Cars obviously occupied the bottom. This is standing in the back, looking over the lily pond up at that second floor loggia. And if you look at the image on the right, one of the really interesting things about the design is when you approach the house, as you saw from the street, it appears a two-story volume. But when you look at it from the water, which was intended to be its main entrance, you see that sort of creature down at the bottom of the pool. So you read the pool, and then the pool wall, and then the two layers of the house. So it's almost like a four-story, very impressive facade from the waterfront. And then this is the closing view looking at the living room with its restoration. All of the colors were found the, paint samples were sent out and pieces were analyzed so that we could get the exact colors. And the exact colors surprised people because over time, things had got painted out. It was a school, people were, whatever paint it was that was like the least difficult to manage with a lot of little kids running around. And so that, when you got to the bottom layer and suddenly something that was white turned that turquoise blue, but it made sense because the reason for that choice had to do with the fact that the room is all about the arched openings that had the Pittsburgh steel, ornamental Pittsburgh steel. And so the idea is that you're constantly looking out. The whole house is designed to keep you as part of the landscape. And that integration of landscape and architecture is a really fundamental principle that Keno kept throughout his practice. Also, I would say his versatility, the fact that there is a room from each of these styles. And so in a way, it isn't the museum in the way that Vizcaya is, right? But it has the kind of qualities in the kinds of work that was brought there. And Iris, you researched all of the places where he bought all of these materials because these things were brought from many distant locations, some handmade, but many antiques.
Right, and a lot of them were designed by Keno himself. He would do sketches of the pieces that he had in mind for a particular space, and then went to a company in Rochester, New York, that would bring in craftsmen from Europe to do sort of essentially high-end replicas of. If you have a Vizcaya, then you have the real thing, and they come on barges. And in El Jardin, which we like to joke sometimes that El Jardin is Vizcaya's little sister. And Vizcaya's little sister, they had these very high-end reproductions from this the Hayden Company, actually in Rochester, New York. So
it is so I think enlightening and important to see a property like El Jardin because. Let's face it, for most of the public today, for most visitors to our community, Gaia really is the principal place that provides a glimpse into this bygone era. So I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit more about the choice of Coconut Grove in the early 20th century as this place that somehow seemed to present these interesting social opportunities, but also, as you mentioned, this kind of paradisical natural environment. And it's certainly not that hard to imagine affluent Northerners coming to South Florida. It is
They're still doing so, right?
Absolutely. Enjoy and welcome to this very day. But I do think it's hard to put ourselves back in the shoes of those 100 years ago when this was a much, much more rustic place, and people like the Bindleys and James Deering opted for Miami and Coconut Grove when they might have chosen something much more established and conventional. And also curious, and I think we know the answer, but as you shared, there are so few specimens of estates like this still around. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how they all vanished in a 30-year period?
Iris, you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll take the last part of that question first because there was a lot there. It is really fascinating to look at this period of time. I think when you just look at the properties, right, they were, for the most part, these estates that were, upwards of 10 acres. And I'm speaking specifically of the properties that were off Main Highway. And very quickly, these, almost as quickly as this incredible society began, it was almost over. Within 20 years, so you have these industrialists. Joanna mentioned Ralph Monroe, really the first sort of really big name. You had Kirk Monroe that came down, the children's author. But from there, the pieces, then William Matheson came and built, first he built Four-Way Lodge, and then he built, first he built his home, which he called Swastika, which is actually
Pelican Lodge.
It changed, the name changed before World War II. And so Pelican Lodge and then Four-Way Lodge, where Arthur Curtis James came down. And so you really have, I think, these.
And William Deering. I mean, William Deering came before James Deering built Vizcaya. The Deering brothers came with their dad. So,
and they were all within a stone's throw of each other.
and David Fairchild and Marion, and his wife was Alexander Graham Bell's daughter. So you had the Grosvenors. It was an incredible, and Ruth.
Mabel Loomis Todd.
Oh my gosh, Mabel Loomis Todd. Yeah.
One of my favorites. And that we could have a whole talk just on her alone, because
Mabel Loomis Todd is the person who edited Emily Dickinson's poems, but was known to have a close relationship with Emily Dickinson's brother, who actually was married at the time. Right, Iris?
Yes, little scandalous. That could be that's a whole other talk and probably
another story. Yeah,
different rating. But really, these are people, as you said, Joel, that could have gone anywhere, right? And it's not just the climate of South Florida, because they could have gone to Palm Beach, and not even Palm Beach. They could have gone 5 miles north to Miami. Miami was, once Flagler's Railroad came down and the Royal Palm Hotel was built, it was a very different society. Whereas early society in Miami tended to revolve around the hotels, the Royal Palm, the Halcyon, the Hermé Hotel, all of those. It was sort of a very social world connected to the hotel, whereas these families that started coming down, these wealthy families that started coming down to Coconut Grove, really were quite isolated amongst themselves. And so a lot of them were members of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. And so you have that connection. And they would go from home to home during the winter season, and really had this incredible, somewhat closed society of life down here. And all for different reasons, but one degree of separation in that they all became either they were friends ahead of time. So, for instance, William Matheson encouraged his friend Arthur Curtis James to come down. As far as we know, for our story specifically, John Binley, he had a niece that was living down in South Florida. Actually, Edna Allen Rickmers, who had a beautiful home on Brickell Bay Drive today. And so she would later say that she was the one who encouraged John Binley to come down and buy the property. We don't have any record from him saying that, but at least he had that family connection. It's not clear if he intended when he came down on his first visit. Interestingly, Joel, John Binley's first recorded visit to South Florida was on the very week that Vizcaya opened. So he comes down, and by March, he comes down Christmas week of 1916. And by March of 1917, John Binley had bought at least the property in Coconut Grove, and then would go on to acquire that additional farmland. So, I mean, with almost instantaneously, within 2 months before he left from his first visit, he had purchased the home.
Yep. I shared with Iris and Joanna that we were very fortunate a few years ago to find a memoir of James Deering's secretary really land in our laps. And it was such an incredible resource to help us understand a little bit more about the early history of Vizcaya. But where did you find all of this stuff? And how long were the two of you working on this book? That was one of the questions that our audience posed.
Well, I would say that we really started working on this book before we even knew each other, because all of the work that was the preparation for all the conservation work required a level of documentation. But interestingly, that documentation was architectural. It was about the landscape. It was about the greater, the Fairchilds, what was happening at Campong, what was happening at the Matheson Estate, linking all of that together. And so that was work that I had been doing with Rocco, with students. Iris brought the genius to say, well, what were these people's motivations and who were they? And then Iris has to be one of, if not the best researcher I've ever worked with, because she could find anything anywhere in the country. Like if you needed something really dug up, Iris would be the person to call. She found lists of things that people buy. You should speak about what you did. But honestly, she's an outstanding researcher. And so she brought the life to this. And that process is actually what changed the book from being essentially, photographs and kind of stories about stuff to actually being the story of people and place. And in that process, for me, I learned a lot. So many things have been happening in our world already. So if as an architect, one did not think that people were actually the reason we do architecture, this experience would say, you know, when we talk about buildings, we need to tell the stories of the people, because speaking about them purely from architectural points of view and style is a very slim story. And Iris really brought the richness to that.
I have to say, Joanna, thank you. As you can see, Joel and everyone, Joanna's incredibly generous with her comments, and a little bit embarrassingly so. But no, this really was so much fun to do, because it's like you just jump down rabbit holes of finding different information. And I am really fascinated as to get to the motivation of why did people come down here?
Mm-hmm.
What was the attraction? Every life is interesting, right? And everyone has their story.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're going back to find out, put those pieces together and construct what that life would have been like. I mean, I would love to be able to go back to this time in Miami history, because it just seems like you had so many really interesting people. Getting back to the question specifically, like, where did we find this stuff? A little bit of everywhere. And you know, people are wonderful, and I think it's great when you call someone up. And you know, in the case of the Binley family, the only letters we had of John Binley, I actually found from Adelaide, his daughter's school, her school records, letters that he had written to the school, something like 120 years ago. And the school in Dobbs Ferry, New York, still had these records, and who knew? And it was just
And the Pittsburgh Historical Society, and what about the Episcopal Church in Los Angeles?
That's right. This wonderful, wonderful gentleman. I'll never forget. He's in his 80s. His name is Walter, and he's the archivist at this St. John's Church in Los Angeles. And I called this gentleman out of the blue and told him what I was doing. And, you know, people are really wonderful and really willing to help out in all sorts of different places. And he went up and he said, well, okay, give me a couple of days. You know, I have to go up in a ladder in the attic, but I might be able to find something. And he actually was able to find Adelaide, a photo of her at the church and her wedding invitation. And so I listen, as my husband will tell you, I get so excited when I find out these little details. So much, if anyone's interested in putting the pieces together of even their own home, of their neighborhood, so much these days is available on digital archives. It's incredible. Back in the day, you could not do any of this, but even during COVID, to sit at your computer, and it takes time, and you have to have the interest, but it's not difficult, because so many of these wonderful, wonderful libraries now have their archives available. So, and
it also, one of the things that I think is important is that the work that Iris has done helps connect bigger pictures. Like as architects, we talk about DeGarmo, right? But DeGarmo's father was the president of Swarthmore. He was a professor at Cornell. He was friends with John Gifford. John Gifford came to be one of the first botany professors at the University of Miami. John Gifford, you know, had theories about landscapes, some of which worked, but they always admitted their mistakes. I have to say, if you read the writings of Fairchild and Gifford, they tell you the Frankensteins, I think is the word that that Fairchild uses, as to that they introduced to the climate inadvertently. But what you realize is the intentions that these people had. And what's interesting is they almost all thought that there was something about this place and this climate that made this a place where it would be possible for people to be their best selves. And I think that's an interesting, there's a bit of a kind of utopian ideal that's threaded through, and it's meant to be shared, not just for the elite, but, you know, working with everyone. And so there are letters, for example, of the pastor of St. Stephen's, who works with the pastor of the church in the West Grove. And the idea was that these two churches were like twins, you know, sibling churches, and what they should share. So there are important stories that are not told, because we tend to look at the kind of the bigger and the things that we can understand and have been recorded. But Iris and I have talked about, it's really important to get the other stories into the mix, because those are important stories too, which you've done at Vizcaya with that great video that you made.
Well, you know, I've pored over the social pages of newspapers, as I know Iris did for this publication, and it can be a little difficult to arrive at a compelling story from a list of names having disembarked in Miami on a certain date. It really takes a lot of interpretation and creativity to bring that all together.
Yes.
So one of our questions relates to Adelaide Bindley, and you all gave a very quick run through of the sort of amazing evolution of ownership of El Jardin. A question was also posed, if I understood and heard you correctly, the property was really built between 1916 and 1920, yes?
1918.
Yes.
1918, okay. And so Adelaide Bindley, one of our questions was, what happened with Adelaide Bindley? And,
Yes.
and certainly her tale of acquiring and losing, and apparently not being terribly troubled by losing at some level El Jardin is a pretty fascinating story.
So Adelaide Bindley, I've spent a lot of time studying Adelaide Bindley and what happened, and I have some answers to that question, but not. I can't even answer it as completely as I would like, because a lot of it is unknown, and it's unclear what her motivations were. But she's an interesting person. So as I mentioned, when her father passed away, she owned the property. She did have a brother, but he died a few years later. He acquired the property that the father owned, that John Bindley owned in Pittsburgh, and he lived there until he passed away, and the property sadly was torn down because it was a beautiful home, which actually Richard Keno, the same architect, had done some work on as well. Richard Keno was a Pittsburgh architect who John Bindley brought down.
Did you mention her marriage?
Yes. So sorry, I digress.
Okay.
So Adelaide Bindley gets married the year that her father passes away. So he passes away in November. She gets married that summer. She only comes back to El Jardin, as far as we know, for to see him down when he was already very sick, and the hope was that he was going to get better and the would be good for him. He didn't. He ended up passing away, and then she leaves with him, and then she doesn't come back. She ends up holding onto the property for a few more years, and then sells it in 1925 to the Ritchie family, but she still held the mortgage. The Ritchie family, does not pay their mortgage, and their real estate business goes bust. Ritchie was the one who tried to develop Shenley Park. Anyway, so Adelaide ends up having to go to the courthouse steps, buy back her own home that she bought back. So she loses it, she buys it back, and then she ends up selling it at in the early 30s, when we're amid the Great Depression, for a fraction. I think it was like $45,000, when the home at one point, when it was built in 1920, was valued at around $1 million in 1920. So it's incredible. She gets married, and she married a pastor in Los Angeles, and moved
of the
out.
Episcopal Church that you got the.
Exactly, St. John's, the pastor of St. John's Church in Los Angeles. And then it's incredible. She never comes back. She lost the property. The brother had sold the property in Pittsburgh, and she lives what appears to be a quiet life. She has one son, one child that died relatively young in his 20s, and she lives a quiet life in Los Angeles, never really returning to South Florida. So she had this beautiful place that was built for her, and we're
the inheritors
we're the
of
ones
it.
we get it. I think it's amazing that one home that was built by a father for his daughter is now home to hundreds of young girls. So it's a nice.
So amazing that she came back to, she cared enough to come back to invest a whole lot of money in acquiring it out of, whatever state
Foreclosure.
foreclosure, but then really lost it again and did not spend much time with it. So turning to the architecture a little bit, Joanna, one of our questions was, do we have a sense of about how many Richard Keno buildings still stand in South Florida? And
Yes.
when you answer that, because you are obviously uniquely qualified to answer that question, I was also hoping you might be able to tell us a little bit more about Richard Keno's 1928 statement that El Jardin and Vizcaya really played this formative role in establishing the Mediterranean revival, known by other names, in South Florida. And that's kind of fascinating when you think about the fact that these, estates were behind these large walls. And so tell us a little bit more about all of that.
I think part of the second part, I think, comes from the fact that Richard Keno caught the eye of George Merrick. And so he did many important buildings in Coral Gables. And that particular style gets chosen. Michael McDonough wrote about this a number of years ago. You might remember him, Joel. He was at UVA, University of Virginia. His theory was that this Mediterranean imagery was very popular in film at that time, the Errol Flynn films. And so the idea that you would have this place that looked very much like what people were seeing in these films was a way to induce people to, as one of the salespeople in Coral Gables had as his script, for people to leave their home in Ohio and come to South Florida, like come to Coral Gables. So I think that there was a kind of, and it wasn't, Miami and South Florida were not the only places that chose this style. Santa Barbara's picking it up, and it's all in that sort of same era. So Michael McDonough could be right about the kind of motivation for it from a sales point of view. But I think what's interesting about Keno is that he was absolutely accomplished in so many ways of representing architecture. So, for example, he did the Second Church of Christ Scientist, which was paid for by Mary Moore, of who the Moorings is named for today. And that is right on Main Highway. People should go and see it, because I understand from Hank Resnick's Coconut Grove Spotlight that a developer has bought it, and we might not see it again. So it's important to go and see it now while you can. There's Chris Rupp at Dade Heritage Trust came up with the idea. We talked with Georgette Balins, my neighbor, because there are Keno homes on St. Gaudens. There's Keno homes on Hibiscus. Iris has gone around and tracked them. So we talked to Chris Rupp about doing a kind of Keno walk, where you start in the Grove from the little buildings that are on like McFarland and Maine, his playhouse, which is beautiful. You can see the kind of Solomonic columns in the bathroom of the playhouse, the Coconut Grove Playhouse. Like it's a place to cherish, right? And then you can continue down Main Highway, Las Brisa, which is now Ransom, and Ransom's the steward of this incredible property. Continuing on to the homes back on the other side of Main Highway, on the west side of Main Highway. So as to how many, Iris, you actually did an account. How many are there?
So we don't have an exact number. We have more in Coral Gables. I would place a number at about, you know what, I'm not even going to try to put a number right now.
Well, I would just say in Coconut Grove alone, on that little Keno walk, and this was just something that we could meet at the center of the Grove and walk down and see them all. We ended up with something like 20 properties of significance.
Wow.
Right. I would say there's about, 24 in Coral Gables. The ones in Miami Beach sadly have not fared as well. Those have been, there was a number of homes, on around La Gorge and Star Island, and those have been subsequently torn down. It's hard, I think it's important. It's important to know, and it's important to know how many of these still exist. And it's sad that we don't really have really great records in terms of Keno, DeGarmo, some of these preeminent architects. And so that's something I think the Dade Heritage Trust is also working on to try to catalog.
And History Miami does have a beautiful set of their drawings, like the DeGarmo drawings and what they have on Keno. So for people who are interested, you could definitely take a look at that. Also, one last point about Keno is many people look at the images of Coral Gables' early colors, and they associate those with Phineas Pace or the Fink brothers, when in fact the colors were tested out at El Jardin. That coral color, the idea of mixing it with the arsenic green, which you could call turquoise, we wouldn't use arsenic today, but all of that kind of color palette is a color palette that was adopted in Coral Gables, and that was kind of tested out at El Jardin.
That's great, thank you. So one of our audience members asked, and this kind of, I think, relates a little bit to what you were mentioning about History Miami and its archives, if they are a homeowner and would like to learn a little bit more about the history of their own property, where would you suggest they start?
Well, I think History Miami is a great place to start. History Miami is a great resource that we have. They have a number of designs, architectural drawings and designs that have been donated over the years, as well as images. They also have early plat maps. So, it's a matter of, just as I was saying earlier, sort of connecting the dots. Sometimes there's rarely sort of one easy, here's the history of your home. It's really sort of figuring out, this is part of this subdivision. When was it platted? Who was behind that? And you sort of go.
Yeah. But if it's Coral Gables, William Fishbaugh was hired to photograph most of the homes of Coral Gables. So you can literally type the address into the Florida State Archive digital collection and find photographs probably that William Fishbaugh took. So that's a good, and then you were telling me, Iris, the Gleason Romer collection is digitized, right?
Miami-Dade Public Library. It really, there's no easy answer to that question because it really depends where in Miami. Some communities are better, the history is better preserved than other areas. Coral Gables is a wonderful example of, it's a little bit easier. They have a wonderful preservation office with great people there to help. So Coral Gables, City Miami, where Coconut Grove is, it's a little bit more of a challenge just because of the resources not being there, but it's there, and there are files that you can go and make an appointment, and any homeowner can go and to the historic resources of the city of Miami and take a look. Doesn't mean that you'll necessarily always find something, but it's fun. It's fun. If anyone is interested to do it, I would highly encourage them to do it because it's a lot of fun to find out and put those pieces together.
I think you two should actually, kind of think about a primetime TV show on the topic to get to know your local home, your local historic home. I've got one last question for you and one last question from the audience. So, we think about Vizcaya as a place that to a very large extent you might think is still what it was, whereas El Jardin has, really evolved. But the truth of the matter is, Vizcaya was its owner's private home for less than 10 years. Then some of his descendants and relatives periodically stayed in the property. But Vizcaya has been a public museum for almost 70 years now, a far longer part of its history, than it ever was a private home. And from day one, decisions had to be made about how you take spaces that were meant for perhaps 10 or 20 people and adapt them to today's demand of 300,000 visitors a year, which we are thrilled to have. El Jardin obviously has experienced very different functional demands and challenges over the years. I'm wondering if you might be able to share with us what you think have been maybe some of the biggest challenges or the biggest preservation victories that the proprietors of El Jardin have faced or overcome.
Well, I think it's a really good question because it's a school, and for many people the budget of the school should really be focused on educating the children, and I think we'd all agree that that's the plan. But then you have this idea that the building can be part of the education of a child. So in general, the notion that investing in the architecture and landscape that children experience in a school as part of their education is kind of built into the Sacred Heart education. And then when you have people who are heads of school like Ann Taylor and Suzanne Cook, who believe this and want to manifest this, then they're willing to do things that are pretty shocking. Like, for example, take down a perfectly functioning building in order to open the view, to restore the historic view and vista of El Jardin. I think that is a move that many people would not do, and they did. And then to figure out a way to use the school so that it's part of the teaching of the program. I think that's another aspect to it. The idea of reintegrating the landscape more, planting the edges, replanting with natives. I just think that kind of commitment it should be everywhere. It shouldn't just be Carrollton. Like, every school has a story. I think of what, look at Edison, you look at some of the incredible work you look at all of the schools in Miami, like every school has this. And what I find sad is when a school erases that history, oh, that building's not important. We don't really need that building. Because once they're gone, they're gone and they don't come back. And I think, I noticed in the questions, Joel, that someone had asked about the people who build it. The story is the people who build it are there. The people who lived, who came from the Bahamas to build these buildings, you have a really fabulous interview on the website of Vizcaya with the descendant of one of the original people who worked at Vizcaya. I think that, these stories are embedded in these places too. And I think that it's important to tell those stories, but when the buildings go away, people don't have them. So I would say the school's commitment and its philosophy, and then I think the state of Florida was a huge help when we had the Cultural Affairs Department really funding historic preservation so the school could get matching grants from the state of Florida. And then that reinforces to people, this is important, this matters, beauty matters. And I can't really emphasize that enough. I think that was unique, but I think it should be everywhere.
Well, I think it's well said, and I think it is really a special challenge when the building that you are the steward of, or the site that you are the steward of, has evolved so dramatically beyond the goal to preserve it in its historic state. That is our goal at Vizcaya. We still have so many challenges, but just acknowledging completely different programmatic requirements at El Jardin for Carrollton. And I think they've done a great job. So I very much enjoyed my opportunity to visit. One of our attendees asked, are there tours, I assume, of...
Carrollton does open each year. And for the centennial year, there were a number of talks and tours, but they do open the school for the villagers. I think have had events. Iris, you would know better what's on the agenda.
It's not in this COVID era, which hopefully we'll be doing things in person very soon, as this talk is evident. But no, so right now they're not. But that's something that the headmaster Olin Kalkas is really interested in opening up and doing more to open up the school to the community. So there have been tours in the past. They're not happening right now at this time in COVID, but that's something that the school really wants to do, and to be able to do walking tours and bike tours, and maybe Joanna and I will do that Keno walk, which would be
so great. Yeah, we need to do that. And especially we should do it if that building, I mean, it pains me to think that we might lose it. It's so lovely. If you haven't seen it, you should. And actually I don't know if the columns that are in the front had lanterns that are exactly like the lanterns at El Jardin.
Well, thank you both so much for the work that you did on this book. It's a great service to our community and our understanding of both the social, cultural, and architectural history of Coconut Grove in South Florida. Really, I've enjoyed my opportunity to talk to you more about it, and I'm sure our audience members did as well. So
this has been wonderful. And actually, there's one more comment here from the audience. Someone saying, bravo. I know every inch of El Jardin, but learned so much this evening. I look forward to purchasing your book. So there you go.
Thank you. And Joel, thank you for taking the time to be with us, because we know the demands on you at Vizcaya are significant. And the work that's being done, people should see the farm village and all of the things that have been done. If they haven't been to Vizcaya lately, it's pretty wonderful.
It's
so
open.
Beautiful. I was just going to ask, it's open, right?
It's open.
It is, yeah. Vizcaya was about the first, perhaps, well, let's just say it was certainly one of the first cultural organizations to reopen. Thanks to our gardens, we've been open for over a year, and it's just been great seeing people enjoy the property throughout all of this. So we welcome your visit.
So beautiful there. So thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation and presentation. And I'll just remind everyone who's out there that you can purchase your copy of El Jardin by calling Books and Books. And if you wanted to be transferred to another store, we're happy to do that. we have some in Coconut Grove. We do have some in Coconut Grove, and they'll be at Bell Harbor shops and in Pinecrest as well. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone watching from everywhere. And I hope that next time it'll be at Books and Books in another beautiful building.
For sure. That would be great.
Beautiful courtyard together. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.